Good morning and good afternoon to some of you. I'm really pleased to welcome you today to our event on the Battery Mineral Supply Challenge. My name is Jane Nakano. I'm a senior fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change here at CSIS, based in Washington, D.C. In recent years, the CSIS energy research focus has included the security of mineral supply chains and what interruptions in these mineral supplies may mean for not just for the clean energy sectors, but then also, I guess, as important as it is, but perhaps more importantly, the climate mitigation efforts around the world. But since late February 2022, concerns over the supply disruptions or interruptions of energy commodities like oil and gas from Russia have brought energy security to the top of political agendas around the world. Minerals are increasingly becoming energy commodities, and they are necessary to manufacture technologies such as batteries, solar panels, and hydrogen electrolyzers. As such, our energy security will increasingly depend on the security of mineral supplies as the energy transition proceeds. Now is the time to build reliable energy, clean energy-related mineral supply chains. The question we want to answer today or explore today is, will the supply of battery minerals keep up with the rapidly growing demand from the EV industry? And where will the supply come from? I'm so pleased this morning that we're joined by three experts on this topic. Kwasi Ampofo is the head of metals and mining at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and he's based in London. And he will share with us insights from their latest EV sales outlook. Jessica Roberts is head of forecasting with London-based Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. She'll share her insights on demand and supply forecasts for battery minerals. And we also have Scott Yarham. He's the global lead for battery metals with S&P Global in London. And he'll share with us his insights on global minerals trading. The way we will run the event today is that following the presentations by these three great experts, there will be moderated discussion with the presenters. For those of you in the audience, there is a link at the event website that you can click on to submit your questions. And now let me turn to my colleague, Isabelle Huber, who is with us with the CSIS Energy Program. She is a visiting fellow from Berlin, and her research focus includes batteries and hydrogen. She will take it from here and introduce more about what we have in mind and also run the moderated discussion. The floor is yours, Isa.
Thank you, Jane. Welcome, Kwasi, Jess, and Scott, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. Today, we focus on the upstream end of the battery supply chain. This is for two reasons. The demand for battery minerals is set to grow fastest among the minerals needed for the energy transition. The second reason is that mining projects, the upstream end of the supply chain, have long lead times, in many regions more than 10 years. The demand for these minerals, however, is growing rapidly. This raises the question, will production keep up with demand? So let's have a look at the demand side first. Kwasi, please get us started.
Thank you. I work with a data company, and I think I would love to use some data and visualizations to make my point. So if you don't mind, can permit me to please share my screen. So there we are. So really going to talk about piece of research that we've, I think, got better and better at over the last years. And we tend to call it the Electric Vehicle Outlook, ABNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. But then what it actually is a transport outlook from now to about 2040. And I think this is the seventh time we've been doing it. And it helps us to take a view of where the transportation sector will be going. So predominantly what drivetrains will drive the market from now to 2040. And beyond that, if we zero it down to electric vehicles, do we have supply chain in place? What battery chemistries will dominate the market? Most importantly, what does it mean for oil demand? Among other questions that we answer. So first, just a teaser of what the report says. This is a picture of the electric vehicle market today. So if you went up to space and you just took a snapshot of where the market was as of December 31st, 2021, you would realize that 1% of EV sales for vans and trucks, or 1% of car sales for vans and trucks were electric. And 42% of 2 and 3 wheelers were actually electric. So that's quite significant. And in a second, I'll talk about why this diverse range matters and even break it down at the country level as to what countries are doing. So now we've taken a picture of what the market looks like today. What would it potentially be? This chart, first of all, takes us back in time before we project into the future. What we are looking at now is that when we took the snapshot of the 1% all the way to 43% for 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, you realize that at the macro level, it seems that we've made progress, but then some countries are actually winning in terms of supply chain, in terms of downstream, more than others. Who are these countries? This chart actually shows that European countries, if you look at the market from a percentage-wise as to vehicles sold and the ones that come as electric, you would notice that obviously Germany tops, the UK is second, France is third, and sitting somewhere below the global average is the United States of America. And this really helps us understand where the market is before I start talking about where the market is going to be. By 2025, the EV industry is going to see tremendous growth. The EV sales will reach about 20.6 million. And in terms of percentage of new vehicles sold, you're looking at about almost 40% for Europe and China coming with a plug. But if we break it down into country and regions, as you can see there, the red country is China. The teal color represents aggregated European countries. Then you have the US in blue, South Korea, Canada, and so on and so forth. But I think the key differentiation I wanted to highlight with this chart is the difference between the United States market and China. And I'll come to that later when we talk about supply chains. So the previous slide was about sales. How about fleets, existing fleets that would be on the road? You can see that the story is no different. And sadly, even the US market share declines significantly by 2025 as a result of cumulative investment Europe and China have made over the last 10 years in the electric vehicle sector. And this two chart represents electric commercial vans and passenger EV fleet. And if we extend that to even look at the electric 2-3-wheeler, which has already reached 43% penetration as of 2021, you're going to see that it's entirely going to be a China story by 2025, with the United States literally playing no role in that market segment. So now this is the way we do our modeling. We first of all take what we call the economic transition scenario, which pretty much looks at current economic policies in countries. So we are not looking at whether a country has pledged net zero. We are not looking at whether a country has potential policies that could come online. Based on what we know about a country today and its trajectory, what would it mean in terms of electric vehicle sales? So that was just what we discussed earlier. Now with this slide, we are looking at what if we look at a net zero scenario where there is zero tailpipe emissions associated with all automobiles. What would that market look like? But then most importantly, how ready are various countries on that trajectory? So we sort of divided it into three broad categories, right? So countries that we think are almost on track. And I want you to take note of these countries because in a second, I will show the next two. You can see South Korea, China, and Germany. So based on our modeling, these are the three countries we believe that per where we're seeing things, they could potentially achieve a zero emission tailpipe from the auto sector by 2050. Which countries are in the positive trajectory? You can see Japan, the United States, and then Australia. And which countries are not on track? You can see the rest of the world, which include most other countries that we've not talked about yet, India, and then Southeast Asia as well. So I've talked about the fact that in terms of global competition with demand, China currently leads, Europe comes second, and then you have the United States. Let's look at the raw materials value chain. Similar to electric vehicles, we're going to see significant growth in demand for batteries as a result of demand for electric vehicles. So from somewhere just under 500 gigawatt hour per year in 2020, we're going to grow to over 5,000 gigawatt hour per year by 2035. And that's quite a significant growth if you look at the fact that although we add in 10, that's quite a significant growth if you are looking at the fact that it's just a 15-year time frame there. And what is driving this high adoption of batteries is simply because prices have fallen over the last 10 years, and we expect that to remain the case over the next 15 years. And this data shows the Bloomberg Battery Price Survey that we publish every year, which looks like the average price for batteries from automakers. The blue line you see there represents our forward-looking curve for battery prices. But then also the dotted lines where we not put in BNF shows the announcement companies have made in terms of where they see battery prices. And you can see that the key conclusion here is the fact that most companies are actually thinking along the same lines our models are saying in terms of where battery prices could potentially be over the next 10 years. So let's take another snapshot of the industry today. So on the left-hand side is the cell capacity by region this year and what we expect that market to be by 2025. And look, the conclusion here is simple. It's still going to be a China story. But remarkably, we're going to see some marginal growth from Europe and also very, very marginal growth from the United States. So I've talked about EV demand. I've talked about the fact that batteries will grow as well. And I've also talked about what is driving battery growth. And then cell manufacturing. Now, let's look at the forecast for battery chemistries. Unlike the traditional internal combustion engine, where the options are limited with respect to either you're driving a gasoline or a diesel, with batteries, there's quite some broad diversity in there. So you can see that the dominant chemistry, which used to be the case for passenger electric vehicles, is no more what it is currently in terms of market share. And we expect that to evolve. And the notable one I wanted to take note is the fact that the LFP has gradually been increasing its market share in the market. And the LFP is one battery chemistry or one cathode chemistry within the lithium-ion battery complex. And I know I probably should have explained what all those names and letters mean. So those names and letters you see beneath there represent the name of the specific battery chemistry. And they are made up of letters. So LFP represents the dominant cathode metal that makes up that battery chemistry. And I also always say this as a side comment, right? Where if you look at the fact that the people who invented the lithium-ion battery are very modest in terms of how they name these chemistries, because LFP, NMC all represent something significant with respect to metals. But if you look at the auto companies and how they name the cars, so Ford is after a name, Toyota is after a name, I think Nissan and Suzuki after a name, but then the battery manufacturers are quite modest with their nomenclature by simply naming them after metals. But that goes on to say that metals indeed play a key role in batteries. So what would the role metals play in batteries be? This chart is showing the demand for batteries and metals from the battery industry. And I think the key take home is that by 2030, we're going to require about 18 million metric tons of metals to power the energy transition, specifically for batteries. And just like cars, just like batteries, the US would have a lot of catch up to do to domesticate the supply chain. So I just wanted to leave you with one thought. How should American auto and battery companies respond? And I think Ford has presented a model last Friday that diversifying your supply chain is very important. Collaborating with manufacturers across across the United States region into other countries will be very relevant, because obviously the US mining capacity is very limited with respect to battery metals. Recycling will play a role, but then we are looking at that post-2030. Technology will play a role, but we are looking at that post-2030 to meet that growing demand by mid-decade. global partnership, global leadership is very important. And this is an example of Ford's disclosed raw material supply agreement that they made last Friday. So I'm probably going to pause here, and I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Kwasi. Well, I guess that you've shown us some really steep growth trajectories here. And China and Europe, but also the United States, although below global average in market share terms, are growing rapidly and are becoming bigger and bigger demand centers for batteries. So very, very interesting to see where these batteries will come from. So next, let's have a look at this supply. And Jess, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Isa. I also have some slides to share, so I will just pull those up as well. And I just want to thank Kwasi as well for that fantastic introduction that he's given to really help frame the discussion and the area of the market that I'm going to focus on now. So the next couple of minutes, really, I'd like to focus on the upstream end of the EV supply chain and lithium-ion battery supply chain. So really looking at the raw materials that are powering these technologies. Now, as we saw from Kwasi, there's no denying that we've got some very robust demand for electric vehicles presently and also forecast into the future as well. And, that's the view of Benchmark as well, is that we have a very strong market coming up. However, we do see some challenges for the supply chain in meeting this demand. And I think the challenges are coming from some different areas, but first and foremost, we have challenges in accessing raw materials on the extraction side. Then there are also challenges in access to facilities that can refine and upgrade these raw materials. And then finally, because we have tightness in supply, we're now also in a landscape of rising costs as well. So we're sort of ultimately pushing up lithium-ion battery cell prices just in this kind of period that we're in at the moment. So where do these supply challenges stem from? Well, what we have is a lithium-ion battery and EV market that's sort of well developed in China and less so in the rest of the world. And this diagram is really showing the Chinese proportion of world supply versus the US and EU in the first 4 stages of the mine to lithium-ion battery supply chain. And if you take a look through these, you can sort of see that China is overwhelmingly dominant in each of them, perhaps with the exception of mining itself. But, it sort of goes without saying, mining operation locations, they reflect geology, they reflect where economic deposits are located in the world, and that's something that we can't really change. I think also when we come to think about China in terms of its mining, we've seen that the last few decades, we've seen a huge growth in the mining industry in China due to its lower cost position primarily. But what China doesn't have in its own resources, we've seen it invest overseas with offtake agreements or to open and operate mines overseas itself, such as the case with nickel in Indonesia. So in Europe and the USA, we can see that the market really is lagging behind China in building out its own lithium-ion battery supply chain. And now there is plenty of work underway to address this, but I think it's worth stressing that it does take varying amounts of time to build out these different lithium-ion battery supply steps. So if we look at mining right at the start of the supply chain, we can see that to develop a greenfield mine can take anything from 5 to 25 years. And that's likely to be the latter end of that range if you're in the US or the EU. Whereas to build out cell manufacturing capabilities, you're perhaps looking at sort of 1 to 2 years instead. So the cumulative effect of all of this really is that it becomes very difficult for the supply chain to respond to rapidly growing lithium-ion battery demand in a sort of cohesive way. But I think with the benefit of national or regional development strategies, these supply chain investments can start to be optimized to ensure that investment is going where it's needed in the supply chain and at the appropriate time as well. So here I just wanted to focus on the supply-demand landscape for the main battery materials. And in lithium, we can see that in 2020, supply was very much dominated by Australia and Chile. And it's interesting to note that China accounts in 2022 for 13% of global extraction, but 60% of lithium chemical capacity. And it's taking large feedstock quantities from Australia. But we can see that the extraction picture is shifting towards the end of the decade. And by 2030, we have the main players still accounting for the bulk of the market, but also some sizable volumes coming through from the US, Canada, and some EU countries. And this will really be essential in reducing supply side risks. I think the new supply landscape will be really welcome, but we do still expect there to be pressures on lithium supply. And from 2030 onwards, there's a rapidly widening gap between supply and demand. And I think what we can sort of term this is as a call for material. So we're saying that there's a gap here where we think there'll need to be new projects developed that haven't been announced yet. And access to finance is really going to be key. You know, our figures show that the lithium industry alone is going to need $42 billion worth of investment to meet 2030 demand. Now, turning to nickel, lithium-ion batteries are really the primary driver of demand growth in the nickel market, although batteries currently accounting for 14% of that overall nickel market. And this is really a trend that we've seen, you know, as Kwasi talked about with the different lithium-ion battery chemistries. What we're seeing in the market is that automakers are transitioning increasingly to nickel-rich cells. And we also see supply growth in the nickel market being overwhelmingly driven by Chinese-financed HPAL operations in Indonesia. We do also see the conversion of nickel pig iron lines to produce nickel matte, and that will also feed demand for lithium-ion batteries. So the result of all of that is we're likely to free up some Class 1 nickel units for the ex-China market. And with those Indonesia investments, we see the overall refined nickel market heading into a surplus this decade. But ESG considerations may deter automakers from Indonesian nickel. So actually what we could see is a bifurcation between the Chinese and ex-China battery markets. And in that sense, China would be well supplied with battery suitable nickel, while ex-China battery markets would be much tighter. Now looking to cobalt. Cobalt's largely extracted as a byproduct of copper or nickel mining, so the extraction locations are determined by operations for copper and nickel. And we can see that copper mine supply is very much a DRC story, accounting for 71% of mine supply in 2021. However, Indonesia is rapidly emerging as the world's second largest producer, and that's due to the development of those cobalt nickel HPAL projects. Now, because of ESG concerns about DRC cobalt and also rising prices, we've seen automakers opting for lower cobalt battery chemistries. However, we don't see cobalt being entirely removed from batteries because of the safety provisions that it gives to batteries. So cobalt demand in batteries will continue to grow, and we see deficits possible from 2025 onwards. But really, I think recycling could play a significant role in supplying the market. Now on to manganese. I think sometimes manganese is overlooked in the battery story, and I think because it's a large market. But when you think about the manganese market, the most volumes are for steel making, well over 95% of the market. And if we look at the supply of grades suitable for batteries, it's actually a different story. So again, it's very much dominated by China when we talk about battery grade material, so high purity manganese sulfate monohydrate. China accounted for 90%, over 90% of supply in 2021. China's also building out large capacities of battery grade manganese sulfate. But on the plus side, in terms of supply security, there is a good pipeline of battery grade manganese sulfate projects being developed in the rest of the world. So Mexico, South Africa, Australia, and so on. There are other routes for producing battery grade manganese via electrolytic manganese metal and electrolytic manganese dioxide. But again, these supply sources are very much dominated by China. Now, turning to the anode side of the market, The choice is really between natural or synthetic graphite. Now, currently, synthetic takes a larger share of lithium-ion battery anode market, but we do see this changing. In terms of the supply for both natural and synthetic graphite, it's really, again, dominated by China. And for spherical graphite, it's essentially 100% produced in China. It's just worth noting that in synthetic graphite, the feedstock for that, needle coke, has different qualities. Not all cokes can produce high quality anodes. And we do see that some of the regular cokes produced in China may not be suitable for EV battery anodes. Now, in terms of the longer trends for the market, longer term trends, we do see natural graphite use in anodes growing and taking market share from synthetic graphite. There are some different factors into that, but we think natural graphite may be preferable on ESG grounds because of its lower carbon footprint. So we can see there are different supply chains and there are different challenges for each of the main lithium-ion battery materials. But I think a consistent theme here is the dominance of China in the supply chain. One aspect that I did just want to touch on is the ESG component, because I think this is gaining more and more attention. And really, I think this is coming from the fact that we need so many investments in lithium-ion battery raw materials. What we need to do is to ensure that in this rush for materials, they're being sourced in a sustainable and responsible way. And I think this is where the EU and the US can really lead the market. Now, there's a lot of text on this slide, but really what I want the main takeaway to be is that there are lots of positive developments in the ESG landscape, but there's still lots of work to be done here as well. You know, just a couple of the issues I'll touch on now, but for instance, there are different ESG frameworks that are being used. So it can be hard to compare between companies, and we're also seeing a lack of auditing to ensure that ESG reports are truthful. And then ESG data needs to be much more granular and look at facility level data if we want to properly assess different supply source risks against ESG criteria. But on that note, I shall finish and hand over back to the team. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess, for another fantastic presentation. I think it's interesting to see what you're showing us, that China's dominance in the supply chain is not necessarily that much in mining, but starts rather for everything that is on the next stages, like processing, the production of cathodes and anodes, and then the battery cells. And you pointed that out too, that these stages of the supply chain are not necessarily geologically constrained, and so they could theoretically take place in another region as well. I guess that's very interesting. You've shown us too that there are supply-demand gaps for several of these minerals looming. On nickel, we saw that the overall market looks quite good, no shortages there due to the projects in Indonesia. Does this mean that for batteries and nickel everything is good and we don't have to worry about that? Or is there, due to this bifurcation of the market in class 1 and class 2 nickel, might there still be some risks?
Yeah, I think, Isa, that's a really good question. I think, as I sort of mentioned during those slides, what I think we're probably seeing now is that start of a bifurcation in the market, in the sense that the Chinese market for battery suitable nickel will be well supplied. They've got that Indonesian supply coming through, and the mixed hydroxide precipitate will be converted in China. But when we look at the rest of the market, perhaps what we're starting to see now is more of a tightness for that battery suitable nickel, the class 1 nickel.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so in our third presentation, let's have a look at the price development for these battery minerals. And Scott, please share your insights there.
Thanks very much, Isa. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me on your presentation. I'm going to be sharing with you some insight into the prices developments in the main cathode markets. I have some slides prepared, which I'm just going to share now. Hopefully you can see those. Great. So I'm part of S&P Global Commodity Insights. What we focus on primarily is price assessments. We're part of a wider group that obviously look at other market fundamentals and forecasts. But really today I'm here to talk about what these assessments are, what they mean for the market, how these have actually developed in the past 18 months. So thanks very much to Jessica and Kwazi for setting the scene. As we see, it's a really exciting developing market, and demand is exploding. There's no two ways about it. And obviously this has had incredible ramifications for these prices. So I won't bore you with the company introduction. I'll move straight in. We basically assess the lithium, cobalt, and nickel markets and manganese on a daily basis. These are your various lithium chemicals that are used primarily, as I say, in your cathode. We both carbonate and hydroxide. I'll get to that a little bit on the differentiators between the two. The same thing with cobalts, the sulfates, which is obviously the main chemical, but also the feedstock, which is primarily hydroxide, primarily coming out of Africa, actually. That's why it's on a CIF, a China basis. The nickel is a nickel sulfate market within the domestic China market. And then manganese, again, we launched actually this week. So it's a brand new assessment. And that's, again, on a domestic China. Our 1 weekly price is spodumene. And spodumene is the raw material. It's basically your hard rock, your lithium-containing hard rock, primarily sourced from Australia, and then getting processed in China into your various nickel lithium chemicals. So just want to give a bit of an insight into how we assess markets. I think that's probably for the beneficiation of most people on this call, how we actually do it. We obviously start with a survey process for these particular markets, and that involves collecting data. So having relationships and contact with your market sources across the supply chain, whether that be producers, converters, miners, and obviously the end users themselves. We obviously then refine this data. We have to have an understanding of that market and market analysis of actually what is driving those prices. It's essentially then coming down to our methodology. And then we obviously publish these prices, which is then used, however it might be, by the market itself. And this can be used in various ways. It could be used as a reference price to understand how markets are developing. So if you're in the financial side or investor, you actually see the health of a certain market, but also by the physical side itself, in sense of actually setting contracts, setting actually what people are actually paying for these markets and for these metals moving forward. Then there's also the futures side, being this on a futures market where people obviously can use these tools to hedge their risk, and obviously make decisions where they see long-term market developments and what that means for their business. So I'm going to skim through the rest, obviously just the essence of time. I don't want to take up too much of the Q&A section, but I just wanted to talk about benchmarking is really about defining standards. And in typically opaque markets, as we find with battery metals, these had very little transparency for a very long period of time, where things were done on a very long-term contract. It was very clandestine, not a lot of transparency in actually what was being bought and sold, but primarily for what price. So what we do is we look at a market and we look at it as a function of time. So we take our prices as a snapshot of what a market value would be at a particular time of a trading day. We then look at other things as those prices are provided to us. What is the quality? Does it fit our specifications? What is the volume? What is the location? The terms of that trade, in other words, what would be the payment terms, delivery terms, everything else that would go into a typical sort of trading contract. And then obviously looking at the credit of risk of both the buyer and the seller. And this basically comes down to what it looks like in our methodology. And this is really our specifications of how we've defined it. I've used lithium here as an example, but obviously we have this with all the battery metals that we cover. And this looks at exactly what I just mentioned earlier, all those certain specifications and thresholds that we have. In other words, what is actually going to be able to be used in that final assessment that we publish each day. And this really has to match up to exactly what is on the specification guide, or normalized as close to as possible what these specifications are. Price is not just about I bought or sold at a certain price. many things affect price. It can be related markets, anything that's unexpected weather. Of course, supply and demand are your bigger fundamentals. I need lithium. I've got lithium to sell. Of course, that's going to be what's used as primary as your base for that price. But there's so many other factors that has to be taken into account when we're actually accepting these prices and obviously providing our price assessments. And this could be anything that's listed on here. A geopolitical event, for instance, of if there was an export ban, if there was a shutdown in a certain trading route, or a certain product was deemed or classified carcinogenic, anything like that would obviously have an immediate effect on prices, you would imagine, and that has to be taken into consideration as well. So when we look at price, it really is just the surface, and once you start scratching beneath that, that's when you start getting actually what is driving those prices at any given point in time, and that's what we assess. Just on terms of, just to give you an understanding of what we focus on the spot markets. So all the prices that we assess and we publish, that is based on spots. These then are used to obviously feed your term contracts, and these term contracts therefore progress to what you'd see as your OTC derivatives, or potentially even your futures markets. Now, this is not to say that every market follows this trajectory. It's just to give you a sense of what you see a Platts price is. If we say lithium carbonate to DDP China is an X price today, it is focused on that spot price, and that spot price is what then feeds the rest of the market tools that obviously are available at any given point in time. So with that very, very brief introduction of how prices are assessed and how we actually do it, I'm just going to move quickly into exactly these markets that we're talking about and the focus on today. And I'm going to be focusing on lithium. Now, given what Kwazi and Jessica went into, no surprises here that lithium prices have been absolutely exploding, and we've seen them move to breaking new highs on almost a weekly basis. It has quietened down as of late. This has primarily been driven by the lockdowns in China, and therefore you saw really a drawback on that trading activity for quite a period of time. But as you can see here, this commodity absolutely exploded, and that really was a case of supply not being able to keep up with demand, and that really is where we are at the moment currently. Now, lithium carbonate and hydroxide are your two main lithium chemicals that go into battery manufacturing. Primarily, carbonate is used for LFP, which Kwazi mentioned earlier in his presentation, and hydroxide primarily goes into your nickel-rich, or sort of your high energy density battery chemistries. Now, typically, hydroxide was always seen as a premium. So if you look at the far left of this chart, you can see that there was a price gap between carbonates and hydroxide. That was really when the focus was all roads led to energy dense. There was really no place foreseen at that point that LFP would be such a major battery chemistry. And what that goes to show is how quickly evolving these battery chemistries and technologies evolve over time. LFP, as we know now, has got a far higher energy density than it did several years back. It's been improved. We can get on a single charge anywhere between 200 and 250 miles on a good charge, which is obviously a very, very competitive battery chemistry. When you think about it, doesn't have cobalt and it doesn't have nickel. Therefore, typically, it is significantly cheaper. And I say that typically because of how the markets obviously evolve. While hydroxide, as I say, really goes into those energy dense chemistries, and therefore actually is now almost at a parity. And that's really interesting in the sense that you actually used to always think there would be a premium, but actually at the moment you're seeing demand for both chemicals equally at the moment. Domestic China is obviously very primarily focused on LFP. There's a much more bigger market share for LFP with domestic China as opposed to the rest of the world. But in so saying that, we have seen several announcements by a number of OEMs saying that LFP is going to be part of their battery mix. It's not going to simply be a China story. So looking at the fundamentals, the EV outlook is strong, as we saw in the very well presented charts earlier, and therefore we're not going to be expecting any fall really in lithium prices anytime soon. As I say, the supply really is struggling to catch up with demand. The same thing could be said, though, for cobalt for some time, although we have seen prices recently drop off quite significantly. Now, the differences that I wanted to highlight is there's cobalt sulfate, which is the main chemical that goes into your battery, your actual battery pack or your cathode. Hydroxide really is the feedstock that is actually used to produce your cobalt sulfate. Hydroxide, primarily coming from Africa, shipped to China where it's refined into that chemical, has typically been priced off metal. This has been a legacy sort of practice of the market, although now we are starting to see that shift. metal was at times used as an intermediate to actually produce your sulfates. That no longer is the case because of economic reasons. You're taking a cobalt ore, so to speak, you're then refining it up to a cobalt metal and breaking it down again to a sulfate. It's a very expensive process, and therefore the hydroxide route, which has really taken to the shape of the last several years, has really been your main sort of precursor to like your battery metal sulfates. So the market is evolving. Pricing practices are changing, not just in lithium in terms of moving away from long-term contracts towards more sort of variable contracts of fixing it to a PRA, which is a price reporting agency such as us, or even moving more towards a spot market. Same thing is happening right now in cobalt. We are seeing this shift away because there is a disconnection actually between the metal price, the hydroxide and the sulfate. You're not using it in stages in terms of a perfect process. And that happens now because you're actually seeing a squeeze, for instance, on a metal, which is now going to be affecting your hydroxide price as a payable. Now, that's obviously problematic in the sense that the metal is not going into batteries. It's going into sectors like aerospace, pigments, medical devices, etc. It's actually not really primarily used for EVs. So a sector that is not, as I say, not EV related, not battery related, is actually what has been driving your hydroxide price, which is obviously now been seen as very problematic because of that hydroxide swelling in production, because obviously that's your fastest growing part of the market, where your smallest part of your market, which is metal, dictating that price. So very exciting time in terms of cobalt, how these pricing mechanics and how these behaviors are evolving as this EV growth continues. And we expect that to see to continue. Now, this graph might point in that direction that NMC growth is potentially low, or that it's not as robust as LFP or lithium carbonate. That isn't the case. We actually see quite an oversupply at the moment in the markets, but primarily, as I say, following the lockdowns in China, you have quite a lot of sulfate that is actually on the ground, and therefore there has been a significant drop in the need for hydroxide. Our market intelligence team, though, does see cobalt moving into a deficit, and as we saw in the charts earlier, that is expected to happen over the next several years, and therefore these prices will undoubtedly normalize and actually start moving up again. But right now, in this snapshot of time, we are seeing prices at an oversupply, and that's not expected to be swallowed up anytime soon. If I move on to nickel, this is in a very interesting market too, as nickel sulfate was primarily used obviously in your energy dense batteries, and was typically priced off your LME primary nickel markets. In Jessica's presentation, you'd see that chart where batteries actually only make up around 15% of total nickel demand, where the primarily nickel is actually used for stainless steel. And if you add on alloys and plating, it's the majority of the market. So you have an EV market, which is nickel sulfate, again, being dictated to by a market that's completely removed from electric vehicles. This has now started to see quite a significant decoupling, where buyers of nickel sulfate are actually saying, well, actually, we should be using a standalone fixed price that is totally based on the fundamentals of the electric vehicle markets. And that's where you start to see a shift away from primary nickel towards nickel sulfates. This was also expedited recently, where we had quite a scenario on the LME markets where prices rose close to actually $100,000 a ton after a short squeeze in the markets, and then dropped down quickly too. I think what this did was actually highlighted to the market of the risk of basing your contracts, your supply contracts, again, on a market that is completely vulnerable to any movements on the stainless steel market. And that's where we've actually started to see this decoupling. Also, the supply concerns around nickel are very interesting to watch. As already been mentioned, the supply coming out of Indonesia has, I would say, initially been looked at as a bit of a reprieve of potentially alleviating supply concerns for Class 1 nickel. However, the ESG concerns, because of the carbon intensity that process has of taking nickel matte and producing nickel sulfates, a lot of your Western OEMs have been very vocal in their concerns of actually having that in their supply chain. So moving forward, the nickel sulfate market is definitely an interesting one to watch, particularly as we see new sources of supply coming on, particularly with those ESG credentials that they've had. So compared to lithium, if you had to plot these prices all together, you would obviously, the cobalt and nickel charts would actually look pretty flat and stable compared to the lithium chart, which has been, as I say, one-way direction really for the last sort of 18 months, with a very, very short reprieve that we've seen recently. Although now that China has eased its lockdown, we have seen prices moving up again. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, looking just at this year, lithium prices are definitely up, while nickel and cobalt are slightly down compared to where they were at the beginning of the year. But historically speaking, both markets are still up. Now, a question we get asked often is, who's actually paying these prices? You know, when we look at these prices for lithium, for cobalt, for nickel, are the battery manufacturers, the car companies, is this the price that they're paying? The answer really is no, not yet. Right, so as I say, particularly if I look at lithium, it has been based on long-term contracts. That was done for a fixed price over several years, and then renegotiated when that contract came to an end. This is now starting to see a shift, and this is not just for lithium, but for cobalt and for nickel too, where producers, understandably looking at prices being the way that they are saying, how can we take advantage of higher prices, but at the same time, how do we maximize utility over time? Because as new production comes on, you would expect prices to come down. So how are we going to make sure that we obviously have a variable contract that obviously is fair and actually acceptable for both buyer and seller? And that's where we're now starting to see a transition away from fixed prices towards a variable price, where these contracts are then being set on a monthly average, quarterly average, whatever it might be, based on a reference price, such as the Platts price. So that is really a live conversation as we speak. This has only really been a step change over the last 12 months, and we expect this to really continue as the year progresses into next year, as those new supply contracts come online. I'm going to stop there because I didn't want to take up any more time of the Q&A, but if you had any more questions on our battery metals or battery metal prices, please do get in touch with myself. We're happy to take any questions on that. But I'll hand it back to you, Isa. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Scott, for this great introduction to mineral trading. And yes, we see that over the last 2 years, the prices have grown for all of these three minerals we were looking at. And outlooks, as you described and previously, Jess, doesn't look like prices will come down a lot, right? So we have seen this one crazy graph on nickel with this price peak earlier this year. And we know that Russia is a big producer of class 1 nickel supplies. Is there some connection? What has happened there?
Yeah, I can take that. So on the class 1 nickel from Russia, we actually didn't see that impact the market immediately. I would say that that's a huge concern for the markets, absolutely, of course, of what might actually happen in terms of if there's further sanctions and if that material is actually going to be used in supply chains. But that massive spike that we saw on the LME particularly, that was nothing to do with the Russian situation. As I say, that was really a short squeeze that we saw with a stainless steel producer. So again, nothing to do with EVs actually. It was primarily done by Stainless, who took a position and believed the market was moving a certain way, and let's say got it wrong. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened with those prices.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I see a question coming in from our audience that kind of fits in what you told us now, so I would like to already address that. You were telling us about this development that we are moving away from long-term contracts to shorter-term contracts, and so the question is, how does it really look like? If I have an EV company, an electric vehicle company, where do I get these raw materials from? Do I have, or let's say, then I might have a contract with a battery producer, and where do they get the raw materials from? Do they have long-term contracts? Is this something that's influencing the prices that are really paid by the battery producers? What happens on the market as there are long-term contracts? And On this backdrop, the question from the audience is, will it be difficult for the US to catch up acquiring additional raw materials for batteries due to the supplies already being contracted to other countries or companies?
Yeah, I can. So if I answer the first part of the question, so when I say that the contracts are moving to more short term, that's not to say that the long-term supply contracts are not remaining long-term, right? So in other words, if I sign what I used to do in, let's say, previous year, if I was a supplier, I would go to a customer and say, you need 10,000 tons of material each year. This is the price that we're going to set it for, and that price would be set. So even if prices escalated, fundamentally that contract is exactly what you would be paying, is whatever we had on that long-term contract. What we're seeing a step change in is still that supply, right? So that supply is still being locked in, but the price is variable. So in other words, if you signed a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year supply agreement, the difference would be is actually what price is paid. And that's where it's up to the negotiation between the buyer and the sellers to say, okay, we'll go on a monthly contract, we'll go a monthly average of whatever, let's say, I'm going to use us obviously, if it's the Platts price month 1 of February, it's X amounts of dollars, that's the price that that's the price we'd pay. If it changed by 5% in March, that's the price we'd pay. So supply is consistent, it's the price that's variable, and therefore you would have that linked to a PRA. So that's I would say is the biggest step change that we've seen. So not so much in terms of length of contract, but just that variability of what actually is the determinant price. In terms of your second part of actually how are people going about securing their material, it's interesting because we've actually now started to see really over the last 6-12 months OEMs, so car makers themselves, actually get involved in the raw material supply chains. So that is actually a big difference. They would obviously leave it up to whoever the cathode producer or the battery makers. They would be the ones responsible for actually sourcing that raw material, and they would have their supply contract with that battery maker. The OEMs have seen, obviously, that there is a supply crunch, and that supply crunch is actually not going to be going away for the foreseeable, and therefore they actively have to be making these investments themselves and actually making sure that they're trying to shore up that raw material supply as much as possible. So that's another step change in terms of OEMs actually getting involved really in the downstream process of securing raw materials. In terms of is it too late? I think there still needs to be a lot of work done and a lot of investment made. I know that the battery metals collectively have seen more investment this year than they have in the several past years put together almost. So the investments are there, but as I think Jessica mentioned in her presentation, it takes time, right? To get these projects actually up and running and actually producing the quality needed, I think that's really underestimated. So while everyone has these grand ambitions of being fully electric by a certain date or having a certain percentage of fully electric, there is a disconnect between raw material supply and actually achieving that electric vehicle fleet.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So I guess that's a very interesting development that EVs now are that they are now entering even mining space as they are trying to secure the minerals they need for producing the EVs because they are in the batteries that are in the EVs. Thanks a lot. So we have about 10 minutes left for our conversation today, and I would like to come back to the projection side together with Jess and Kwasi. And I guess the simple questions I would like to ask is, what's the problem with mining projects? Why don't we see more supply coming online so that we don't run into those supply demand gaps that are looming? Jess, maybe you can take that question first.
Yeah, thanks, Isa. I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think, fundamentally, we have to look at how long it takes to develop, particularly a greenfield mine. That sort of range I showed of 5 to 20 years. It's a long time. It's a long investment, and so when we're talking about our projections for the market, we're Kwasi, Scott, and we're giving projections perhaps out to 2040, which is 18 years away, and that means we need to start building the mines now that are going to be supplying the markets for 2040. So I think there's a sort of a lack of perhaps coordinated planning that might have been affecting the market. you've also got other factors like low price environments. So if the price isn't good, there isn't really an incentive to develop a new mine project. There has to be a certain price level in the market in order for that new supply to sort of be developed as well. And I think, there are other factors as well. We're increasingly having to develop mine projects that have a lower grade. There are ESG considerations as well that slow things down. And I think, not to sort of put too fine a point on it as well, but you've got things like NIMBYism, so not in my backyard. I think in Europe, in particular, we have a disconnect between the knowledge of our devices, our smartphones. We all enjoy using them, but we don't sort of link that back to the fact that they come from a metal, from a mine. So I think there are lots of different sort of attitudes that play a role in that, and not to mention the fact that investment in mining still hasn't really recovered from the sort of levels in 2008, the sort of pre-financial crash investment levels. We haven't got back to those yet. So lots of different factors.
Thank you. Vasi, do you have anything to add to the challenges for mining projects getting started?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And then I think I'll probably link it to a question that you asked earlier about the US catching up on the mining side. And I think just because it mentioned it, but I want to beautifully put it as so even China realized that there are certain things that are gifts from nature. You either have it or you don't. And it's like oil, right? It's like maybe 10, 20 years ago, the US government spending 10 billions simply to explore oil that probably doesn't exist in the US. So you either have it in the ground or you don't. So there are two things you can do when you don't have it in the ground. One is to look at partnerships, and the IEA and the OPEC is one example where, okay, we don't have it in the US, right? But how about we create a consortium with other countries who have it, and then see where we can sort of leverage our strength and weaknesses there. And number two is technology. So 10 years ago, if you had looked at the oil industry and said that, oh, maybe the US will be able to produce enough of its oil to meet its domestic demand, the answer would have been ha. But then, of course, technology has a way of making things possible, and obviously fracking. So the second way to look at it is technology. Technology is what can make a non-existent geological deposit existent, or a low grade, a high grade. So there's the money part, which is, more resource reserve mining term. But then also there's the technology part where all of a sudden deposits that existed that were not able to be extracted can become viable deposits. So I think those are the two things. And as to the development, I will leave you with this, that is money. So every year at Bloomberg NEF, we track the amount of money going into the energy transition sector. So there are three numbers I want to give you here. Number one, the amount of money that went into the electric vehicle industry is 270 billion, right? That was 2021. Last year, same for storage, about 7 billion. Do you know how much of that went directly into mining projects? Pretty much nothing, right? In the single billions there, less than a direct capex that went into project, just to be clear here. And you can see there's a big mismatch, but then it's taking the EV industry to get to where it is. Of course, the likes of Elon Musk really puts in the spotlight on the sector. Then came the battery side as well, where all of a sudden, almost every European country is competing to build a battery startup. And I think with time, now that we are highlighting the challenges with events like this, and also with research like all of us are producing, I think the spotlight is going to fall on the supply side as well. And we're going to see the CapEx flow upstream into these projects as well.
Thank you. That's a very interesting comparison. To shed some light on the importance of technology and comparing mineral extraction to what was going on with a shale oil boom in the United States. Good day. You also said, let's build partnerships. We've seen one here. The Mineral Security Partnership was established last month in June by the United States, by Australia, Canada, some European countries, and others. I guess that will be very interesting to see how all this will evolve, and how international cooperation in this topic will help to address this mineral supply challenge ahead. So, yeah, time is flying. We're already at the end of this event today. Let me super quickly wrap that up. Kwasi, you helped us to understand that EV sales are growing rapidly, with China, Europe, and the United States the biggest markets. And these countries are the demand centers for batteries now. So batteries have either be to produce there or they have to be shipped there. However, on the supply side, as we've seen with Jess, demand supply gaps are looming for several battery minerals, and the world must produce more minerals. But we see challenges here. And the challenge for ramping up supply is not the only challenge we see here. We also have to address the diversification of supply chains. And it was pointed out by Jess, by Kwasi, I guess by Scott, China is very dominant in this supply chain, not necessarily in mining, but in everything that comes next. If you want to diversify supply chains for energy security, then there is some work to do in this space, I guess. And awareness for supply chains and minerals is growing. Mineral security partnership emerging. Let's see where this goes to. So with this, I want to thank you all for this great conversation, for sharing all your insights with us today. And I want to turn back to Jane for her closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa. On behalf of the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program, I'd like to thank Kwasi from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Jess Roberts from Benchmark Minerals, and also Scott Yarham from S&P Global. And then also, last but not least, Isa, you did a great job, not just organizing, but I really enjoyed the conversation all four of you had. And also, those of you in the audience, thank you so much for joining, and look forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you.